And we also have our website up here. Jeff, is it up here or?
It's a picture of the website.
Yeah. All right. Now for our speaker, we are very pleased to have J. Eric Robinson as our speaker this evening. The title of the lecture is Discovering the Underground Railroad. Eric Robinson is a historian, an assistant professor of history at the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy in St. Louis. He has been conducting tours and giving lectures for over 20 years on the Underground Railroad. Please give a warm welcome to Professor J. Eric Robinson.
Thank you. You will forgive me. When I take off my glasses, I actually sound like James Earl Jones. It's not that funny. But I was telling Ms. DeWeese that this is my second visit on this topic with Historic Elsah. John Williams, when he had considerably less things to do, invited me to visit with you after the flood of 1993. And one of the people who was there was the woman who was formerly known as Mrs. Charles Hosmer, Geraldine, who some of you might remember had the Jeremiah's store around the corner. And I had noticed that in coming in here, this room is named after Charles Hosmer, which I thought was an awfully wonderful touch. I knew Mrs. Hosmer back when I was, I'm going to give off her age, back when I was in high school. She was secretary of the Alton branch of the NAACP in my senior year of high school, and I was the president of the Alton NAACP Youth Council. And I first got to know her from sitting in those meetings, and I was very impressed with humanity that the Hosmer family had, and I was so they were so wonderful. Geraldine had gotten to be a friend of mine, and when I was an adult, if you could believe that, and president of the Elijah P. Lovejoy Memorial, she was very active in that. And she was kind enough to to ask a tour for her daughter looked just like her, and her grandchildren. Because in the building of Jeremiah's, there was a cellar. Some of you might have heard that story. There was a cellar. And its cellar was underneath floors like this. It was about deep enough that a grown man, say your size, sir, could move around in crouching. And she wondered if that was an Underground Railroad location. And I had to be honest with her. I'd heard some stories about Elsah's activities with the Underground Railroad. One of my friends many years ago was a man by the name of John Keller, who was of the family that owned the old Wedge Bank, Alton Banking and Trust. And John Keller's family originally was in Elsah. They were bakers. And John told the story that that his family had escaped things, or had secret rooms. It gets kind of elaborate stories. John also swore to me that there was a tunnel that connected Evergreens on the campus of Lewis Clark Community College to the old site of the Benjamin Godfrey Chapel. Some of us are old enough to remember, and that chapel was originally across the road. And most likely that was a service tunnel, some type of thing. And you, of course, may have been familiar with the story in the Telegraph when the house on Langdon and 4th Street had a sidewalk come down, and they had this kind of
subterranean structure there, and they were making a big to-do about it. And it was published in the local newspaper, and it ended up catching the attention of a producer at for Traction Media in Toronto, Canada, and they called up and asked, "Is that an Underground Railroad tunnel?" I said, "Well, most likely no, because the building's not that old. It's only from about the 1870s. 1870s is not very old for me." And so I said, "Well, and I did mention instead the building across the street from Alton YWCA, the Enos Apartments, which has this nice subterranean structure, which they said had escaped slaves. And if you're in Alton at any degree of time, you might be familiar with the name Grace Monroe, who performed many, many years ago. I mean, gosh, this is how old are you? Oh, is everybody here? Was anybody here around here back in 1986? Anybody alive back in 1986? I gotta ask that every now and then, because I teach students and I look at them and I said, "Well, remember when Bill Clinton was president?" I said, "No." Because everybody that I talk to on a given day is from the 21st century. Stop to think about it. Everybody that I talk to is from the 21st century. And chances are they're going to talk to somebody that's going to know somebody from the 22nd century. We will have to explain to them what Captain Kirk was. But at any rate, and I explained to them, well, these were, Grace Monroe used to do her Harriet Tubman presentations in these apartments, tunnel. And what I tried to explain to people is, first of all, we have to remember that buildings that utilized all of their spaces are relatively new in construction. There's something that's a phenomenon mostly of the 20th century. A lot of our buildings from the 19th century in the United States and internationally have a lot of dead space because it was insulation. And that's where they put in these closets and these stairwells. And later, that's where they put in the bathrooms when we got plumbing. And I tell people, well, when back then, we did not have electricity and we did not have refrigeration. So we had to store things where there would not be around any rodents. And when I said to Geraldine, I said, most likely the structure that you're looking at was a root cellar. Most likely it was a root cellar. It was where you stored, say, your potatoes and your turnips and your beans. And another place that has it, they have it well preserved, and is the Chaney Mansion at the Jersey County Historical Society. They have a subterranean structure that was a root cellar, was used for that, set off from the basement. That was a very commonly thing done. But with these basements, these cellars, these coal sheds with the English apartments place was, not the water cistern that collapsed when that sidewalk fell apart some months ago. But everything else, most likely those built structures were used to hide escaped slaves because you pressed them into service when you had to. I do understand that we're all concerned about the news and what is going on in Europe, but we have to remember as well that the people who hid most of the populations from the Ukraine were hiding from the Nazis first and the Soviets after that. They hid them in dead spaces too. Nice place to hide people. My grandfather, and by the way, I want to introduce my brother, Ralph Robinson. He is in the back there. He doesn't have an opportunity to hear all my talks. He usually closes the door when I start talking. And he says, put the glasses on, you still sound like Pee Wee Herman. But our grandfather, my brother's real name is Ralph. That's his real first name. And he's named after Dad and Grandpa Robinson. And Grandpa Robinson was and during the time of World War II, he was a coal and ice merchant. And when he delivered coal, it was not uncommon that the coal chutes in Edwardsville were out in front of the house, dead space. And so when Grandpa had to deliver coal, he opened the coal chute, he stuck his head down there and yelled, "Coal coming," because children played hide and seek in coal sheds. And nothing ruins an account quite like a little kid getting a mouthful of coal on top. And so there, I explained to people, most likely this is a place where they had escaped slaves because they pressed it into service. And like I said in my interview, these are everyday people like you are, like I am, an everyday person. I'll tell you how everyday they were. Is there anybody in here who has a person in your life who loves you more than mama? Anybody who's beloved by somebody more than they love their mama? You know what I'm talking about? Grandchildren. Anybody have a grandchild in their life? Anybody have a grandchild in your life? I had a lot of good tours going on. I think one that I had that was probably one of my favorites was a tour just before the pandemic closed everything down in 2020. It was back when I didn't have my cataract removed. And I had a tour that was a 4-generation family from Effingham. And it was the gentleman was in his 80s. His wife was in her 80s. They had their 60-year-old baby there. And their 60-year-old baby had her 30-year-old baby. And the 30-year-old baby brought her husband. And they had this, of course, this little kid. And the little kid just sat there and hung on every word. And when I talked about the Underground Railroad, I said, the simple thing is, I turned to the 6-year-old, you're always mom and daddy's baby. And the only thing, if I say the wrong thing to you, the only thing that's going to keep daddy from beating me up is mom's going to beat me to it. You ever heard about that? And don't do anything with the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter. You're really putting your life in your hands. Now, I wonder how many of you have that impression with members of your family. Is there anybody who has a member of their family who is a teenager now? I hear some laughs and some giggles. Maybe not a grandchild, but somebody in your family that's a teenager. Any teenage girls? Teenage girls' attitude. Great paper writers, but boy, are they attitude. All right. Want something horrible? Imagine not knowing where they are. Worse yet, imagine not knowing that they're safe. Is that unthinkable? How about this one? Imagine them being in your presence and them not being safe and you completely unable to do anything to save them. I see your face. And even though you're wearing masks, I see your faces too. Welcome to American slavery, ladies and gentlemen. Oftentimes the questions that I get are not just where did they hide? The where they hide question is very simple. It's very easy to figure, especially in this part of the country. You look for rivers. Terry Ransom, formerly of the Illinois Department of Transportation, did research on this back in the 80s and 90s. He was a brilliant researcher. I hope Terry is well. But he was able to notice that the Underground Railroad line coming out of St. Louis and coming through Alton followed the Illinois River. And if you follow the Illinois River upstream, you're following the Underground Railroad route. It ended in Chicago. And at Chicago, they would either head into southeastern Wisconsin, bless you, or they would head across the river, across the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, into Western Michigan, or more likely they'd hop a boat because Chicago was a great port for the Great Lakes. Hop a boat and sail the boat all the way to Detroit, where the Second Baptist Church of Detroit's Vigilant Committee would help them go to Canada, places like Dresden and Chatham, and Wilberforce and Dawn, Ontario, where there was a man by the name of Josiah Henson. Everybody called Si, but as some people call Uncle Tom, because it's basis of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Terry Ransom noticed this, and if you're everywhere near the river, you generally find an Underground Railroad line somewhere, a site somewhere. It's not a coincidence that Dean's Apartments is a mere 3 blocks north of the Mississippi River. The river's there. And you can follow that and the other lines close by. Excuse me. This is rather weird. I usually don't get all choked up if I'm not talking about myself. No, I have it right here. Is this a product placement? Commercial break, yeah. And Terry pointed out this was the route that you would go. And this is one of the routes you would go. We follow the rivers. You can find them anywhere near there. And he was quite accurate. If you look at locations, say, of AME churches at the turn of the 20th century, they also are located along those routes. And so we have the idea that people did travel to locations and as far as they wanted and settled at one time. So where the question about where they hid and how they hid, those questions are rather simple. A more complicated question that we have to try to answer is, why did they escape? You have an idea over their families. Are you thinking about those teenagers? Those teenage girls? Guess who would escape? And guess why they would escape? It's quite accurate when we talk about escapes as slaves. A lot of them were young. I am, believe it or not, only 56. Don't look that amazed. I've looked this way since I was 17. Gerald would recognize me. But I'm 56 years old. A man 56 years old would be considered too old. Possibly closer to 30 or under 30. A man of 56 might have a number of, we would call them diseases associated with aging. They're associated with diabetes and arthritis and heart disease, kidney disease, all those things that we're familiar with. They would have had access to it. And in fact, the people that I'm looking in the room, most of the people in the room back in the 1850s would have been lucky to reach 60. Especially if you were a woman that gave birth to children, because they had a high mortality rate in childbirth. So we'd be too old to escape. But when we were young, we would escape. Where did we? Well, that's one motivation. That when you're young, you're about to be sold. Especially if you're a young woman. Keep that young adolescent girl in your mind. That young adolescent girl. You have a young adolescent girl in your family, do you not? Not at all? I thought I saw somebody that had a young girl in her family. I see somebody. Yeah, okay. That, pardon? Could be raped, yes, definitely. You could be raped under any circumstance. You could be raped in the context of marriage. Let's remember that states this part of the country did not have an idea of spousal rape until the 1980s. Yeah. But the young girl in your family would be at the height of her price. For that young lady, if I were to buy her, I would have, I'd be wealthy enough to own a house as large as this one. She would help me run it. I would get her, incidentally, at the slave markets in downtown St. Louis. You've all been there, haven't you? Of course you have. It's where the arch grounds are. It's where the baseball stadium is. It's right in there. One of the biggest slave traders was named Bernard Lynch. There's a street named after him by the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. What he did as far as his practice of business, we got this idea about it. He would apparently engage in activity. Oh, by the way, how many of you are antiquers or yard sailors? Okay, all right. You know, one of the ways that you get a nice set of antiques, style, the way of doing it, you read about somebody dying and you go and buy out their estate. And you pick through the estate to see what's of value. Guess how Bernard Lynch got his allotment of slaves? Person had an estate sale, buy them, sell them at a bigger profit. And for that teenage girl, the profit would go up. We do understand that sometimes slaves, the period of time from the time that a slave is purchased by Lynch and subsequently sold, it took several months. We do all understand how much adolescents can eat in several months. Got to get them to work. You're familiar with the phrase farming out, are you not? Well, they farmed out the slave to work as, and it depended on the place in which they did that. For example, in Louisiana and in parts of the Gulf Coast, farming out meant renting out your coffle of slaves to somebody who needed to bring in a harvest, such as sugar or cotton. and they would go as labor to work for another planter for a period of time. That planter paid for the service to the owner, and the owner basically had sufficient funds to maintain his property with that. That's how Lehman Brothers first made its money. Lehman Brothers were Negro traders in Montgomery, Alabama, on Dexter Avenue, incidentally. Some of us know that name in Montgomery. But here was Lynch. He would buy people from other people as part of, say, settling an estate, and he would sell them to planters coming from Louisiana. And he sold the young women first. They were the profit. Now, we don't understand entirely why somebody would sell their slaves to Lynch. We don't understand it entirely. We have some ideas. For example, are there any Missourians here? No Missourian? Oh, good, you're all legal. Well, Missouri has something called a personal property tax. Other states in the Union had something that's illegal now called a poll tax. The personal property tax in Missouri originally began as a tax on your personal property. Guess what they were taxing? They were taxing people, your slaves. And that tax was due at the end of the year. Well, you had to pay your tax. So to pay your tax, you unloaded your property. By the way, speaking of which, I told you if I had that young lady, I'd be able to own a house like this. Let me tell you what that young lady would be worth in today's money. It's close to $45,000. Gives you a different idea about teenagers. $45,000. That's about roughly the equivalent to about $500 back then. And $500 is good money. Wouldn't you want to get back what you invested at $500? 45,000. Yeah, I want that back. I want that back. But back to the issue about why people escaped. Imminent sale, risk of sexual assault, reasons for an escape. Okay. Most of your slaves in this part of the South, we are in the South, were family units held by family units. The number of slaveholders and the number of slaves were roughly equal in the state of Missouri. And every county in Missouri, with the exception of Douglas County in the far northwest, had a slave community in it, and slave holders in it. When you talk about the slaves who were located on the eastern side of the county, they were located near of Missouri. They were located in counties along the river. So St. Charles County, up on Rawls County, across river from Quincy. They had a large number of slaves here, but still roughly family unit with family unit. And back then, the slaves were trained craftsmen. We forget that about them. Our understanding in the 20th century was that American slaves were basically dumb, brute labor that was used as unskilled labor in agricultural purposes. There were some like that, but they were primarily located in places where there was large-scale industrialized agricultural production, such as cotton regions, rice-growing regions, sugar-growing regions. It's not the entire South. It's parts of the South, like in the Delta, or in South Carolina, or maybe East Texas, maybe the Black Belt of Alabama, but other parts of the country, other parts of the South, they were not like that. That was not used in that way. The slaves were instead trained labor that was used to augment white labor. And that included both men and women being trained labor. For example, St. Louis had an active garment industry at the time of the Civil War. It was the center of fashion in the West. A number of your people who worked in those the garment industry and as well as the shoemaking industry in St. Louis were slaves. They were slave labor. They were slave labor who were trained craftsmen, such as Elizabeth Keckley, the dressmaker of Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. She was also the dressmaker for Julia Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis. In the 1850s, she worked as a slave in the garment industry in St. Louis. And during her time working in the garment industry in St. Louis, she was able to earn enough money to buy her entire family out of freedom. That's another benefit about farming out somebody. They would earn money for the purpose of buying themselves, buying their freedom. Yes, that's one of the things that you had to think about, buying your freedom. Oftentimes with slaves, we have the story mentioned throughout, family members would come together and try to purchase the freedom of older family members, such that if I were, or rather my brother's the father of 5 men, those 5 men would work to buy their freedom, and they'd turn around and buy the freedom as well of my brother and his wife. That was one of the, and even if it happened when my brother was past mumbly age, which I can't tell you what his age is right now because I need him to drive me home. But if I were to tell you past mumbly age, it would still work to buy this freedom. I know quite a few of you are familiar with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or have heard about it. You've heard the stories about it. There's a AME church called Rocky Fork, New Bethel AME Church in Godfrey, which had the Rocky Fork community nearby, community of about 400 free blacks, bless you, living on the Piasaw Creek, that was used to hide and house escaped slaves. That's quite accurate. But what a lot of people are not familiar with was that the founding bishop of the AME Church, Richard Allen, was born a slave in the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, where all that meets on the Chesapeake. He was born a slave there. He converted to Methodism, and through his conversion to Methodism, he was able to convert his master, and he urged his master to help allow him to buy his family's freedom. So Allen and his siblings worked to buy their freedom, and once they got their freedom, they worked to buy their parents' freedom as well. But you're more interested in why people escape. Buying and selling, sexual assault, being able to buy off your freedom, quite true. Going to communities, quite true. Why did people escape? Opportunity. When the cat's away, the mice will play. The person I think with opportunity was a woman by the name of Gertrude Bartleby. That's what the name is handed down to us. In August 1853, she escaped the slave markets in downtown St. Louis because there was a bachelor doctor who wanted her for his own purposes. I wonder what that was about, you know? And he kept looking at her, and her friends told her, you need to escape. This man is really evil looking there. And she escaped by means of getting a note. You needed a note back then to ride the Mississippi River. You get a note, you could ride the Mississippi River up and downstream. White people would leave you alone. And she had this note, and she was able to get on a packet, a little boat, or rather a riverboat that ran regularly as a taxi between downtown St. Louis and downtown Alton. And when she got into Alton, she came up. You have to remember, the Mississippi River changed in 1928, 1929. Thales is right. You never step in the same river twice. And back in the 1850s, the Mississippi River was a lot closer to Alton than it is. Much of that park where that horrible gambling boat is, much of that park was the Mississippi River. And Landmarks Boulevard, as they call it now, I know Maryland's really liked that name. Landmark Boulevard was actually the riverbank. And Gertrude Bartleby came off there were about 100 slips there for riverboats along the Mississippi River at Alton. She came off the riverboat, and you can imagine that they were teeming with life, because at Alton, not only did passengers get off the riverboat to do business at Alton and go home, but you also had people who were taking crops from the deep south, like cotton, or tobacco. And they were rebaling it with stuff that was grown over in St. Charles County. The hemp was used for that. And the people who were rebaling it were usually, contrary to what that Rotary Club picture on the side of the FSVNA building is, they were usually Negroes. Imagine that scene. Gertrude Bartleby, we're told by the family that helped her escape, the Van Arsdale family of Brighton, Illinois, was described as being as dark as a French woman. She's what they used to call a mulatto. Very fair-skinned woman. We had a cousin on our maternal grandfather's side, Cousin Marie. The old name they used to give her, she used to hate it. They used to call her Noctoroon because she was very fair. It's quite true. You show a picture of her and about you, and you people couldn't figure her out. You couldn't find her at all. Didn't realize that she was a Negro. She identified as a Negro, but wouldn't know it at all. Very fair. And Gertrude Bartleby was described as very fair, and she wore this nice veil. So she probably walked up to somebody or heard them talking about someone, and she crossed the road, crossed the wharf. On the Mississippi River bank at Alton, there were hotels, a variety of hotels. Those hotels had lobbies. I mean, they were small places, kind of like the Rubel. Do they still have the Rubel Hotel around? Yeah, kind of like the Rubel Hotel. It had lobbies, and had somebody there who was cutting hair. And there was a Negro there cutting hair named Isaac Kelly. And Isaac Kelly was a Prince Hall Mason. The Prince Hall Masons, which were founded in the 1760s in Boston, were a free Black group that had escaped slaves. And the Prince Hall Masons cover was Jocko the Lawn Jockey. stately lawn jockey. Oh, actually, this is vulgar. It's more like this. Standing there for their horses. And Kelly probably directed her up the hill, up George Street. But why did she escape? That bachelor doctor? Opportunity? Most likely that. Most likely that. And then when whoever held her, probably Lynch, realized that she was gone, he published notices of her running away. And he had her description. You know, kind of like tall, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, white hair, mustache, glasses, and a voice that will peel stencil. When they had descriptions of escaped slaves, they did not have photography in general. So what you would have as a descriptor would be something that would give the person an idea who they're talking about. So we were talking about something denoting character, such as reserved, such as bright and intelligent looking, inquisitive, something about their habits, more than just saying that they were a slave. Opportunity could only be caught if you were very attentive. And the slaveholder, we're talking about $5,000 here, right? If you're very attentive, you paid attention to your $45,000. Am I right? Yes, you are. So I like to touch on these questions rather than just a question, where did they hide? Does it sound a little more interesting than just dead space? I think it does. I think it does. I was glad that you referenced the interview that I did on St. Louis Public Radio, I believe it was. And it's a one interview where the picture of me was from. It's a wonderful interview. Sarah Fensky did a fantastic job with it. I began my tours back in 1995 as part of my radio program, Eavesdropping, which was on WBGC. And basically with that, I also did about 26 minutes of rambling and people said, okay. But with Ms. Fensky, I came in and I had to warn her because I said, I'm going to say something that's going to really startle you. She said, okay, I'm prepared. And she was very professional about it. We're talking about a professional journalist who had been doing this job for years. And when I mentioned her, do you have a child? Yeah, I have a child. Yeah. What was it, a boy or girl? She told me it was a girl. Okay. Well, how old is she? Yeah, I can get some good money for her. And so then I asked her, do you have a man? You mean a husband? Yeah. Do you have a husband? Yeah. Yeah, I do. Oh, well, you don't need one of those. And slowly she realized, so what I was doing to her was I was treating her not as a person. And she's reacting to it as a person. Wow. Makes us stop to think about it. Makes us stop to think. A lot more interesting than talking about dead space. quilts, so forth. Now, usually I give time to answer questions. Is that okay? Because then I can ramble a little bit longer if you do that. You must have one or two. Yes, please. I will try to repeat the question for our audience on Zoom.
I was thinking of the tunnel that you were talking about that was found recently.
Yes,
Was the person we found out that it wasn't an underground road?
was the person disappointed to find out it wasn't an underground railroad? Yes, they usually are. They usually are. People are very disappointed to discover that their tunnels were not underground railroad because usually somebody had told them. And to be honest, I approach it buildings like that as a historian. I think I'm not the only one. Donnie Huber was also the one who told me, that building's not old enough for that. First of all, if you talk about ages of buildings, the style of a building that's from before the Civil War is very consistent in certain places. If you have a building that has more of a style from about the 1870s, no, it's not. It's not. Such as the Evergreens is an Italianate style structure. Italianate buildings are from the 1870s generally, or they're from the 1860s. They're very rarely from before the Civil War. So chances are those were not underground railroad locations. People are usually disappointed when you tell people that. Conversely, if you have a building that uses more natural elements like stone, like a number of the stone buildings here in Elsah, and you explain to them, typically those stone buildings in the Alton area are from before the Civil War, so it's plausible. They get very happy. Very pleased. But what really disappoints people the most is that a number of the buildings that were from before the Civil War were torn down before the turn of the 20th century. A number of them, almost all of them were. And the thing that I think disappoints people the most is this lost history of Alton. And it's not just the lost history of Alton, it's the lost history of America. Unfortunately, we think that if it's old and if it's not associated with the name with which we recognize, that there's no importance to it, which is very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. And yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'll get you next, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. So there was escaping, buying your freedom, and about suits, bringing the suits
Mhm.
to make your case that you actually were Mr. Grant freedom, or the status, you lost your status. Was that in this larger? Yeah.
In addition to escaping, buying your freedom, and bringing suits, there was the possibility that a person could be born free and could attain their freedom. The difference is when we talk about people who are free, the default is that that you're automatically a slave. That's the default. People who are born free, generally speaking, had to have documentation. Okay. This is my Illinois ID. It's technically, can I use this to get on a plane? No, I don't have a mask. Well, this is an official document that that does not necessarily give me personhood, but gives me certain rights. Board a plane, if it's a driver's license, I have a right to operate a motor vehicle. Okay. You are familiar with your passports. I think everybody's familiar with their passports. You need a passport if you're going to travel outside the United States. It guarantees your rights as an American citizen or as any citizen of any country, the passport. Those were not the type of things that you would have if you were to purchase your freedom or attain your freedom any other way. In Illinois, in Missouri, it was called Freedom Papers. The Freedom Papers looked like, for all intents and purposes, and served the same purpose as a deed of sale. In Missouri, the Freedom Papers were available if a third party vouched for you before a judge. The judge signed the affidavit, put a seal on it, and gave it to you. It's literally the same as if a probate judge gave you the deed to a piece of property, and that can be transferred over. Number of states had comparable documents. And as you understand, with a deed or a will, it's a legally binding document. Okay, that's not Illinois. And Illinois is not the driver's license. Illinois rather is this. It's a simple receipt. I'm going to guesstimate that the teenage girl that you're thinking about looks like a little girl. Is that correct? She still looks like a little girl. Well, we all know of kids 12 who look grown. I remember very well, there was a tour that I had many years ago. I think the kid now must have kids of their own. The kid was 6'7" and in 5th grade. A redhead. Why do I always get the redheads? He was a redhead, 6'7". I looked at him and I said, they gave up spanking you a long time ago. Okay. When a person in Illinois, when a person became an adult, however you care to define an adult, they needed one of these. They got it for $500. Again, the equivalent of a year's income. The Illinois law that, how many of you are from Illinois? Okay, I'm gonna have to explain something to you people. Illinois law required that to get one of these, you had to post the bond with a county official. They did not specify what happened to the money. They did not say it goes into probate. It was non-transferable. So when you move from Pike County to Adams County, you had to post another bond. It didn't say what official had to get it. Had to be a county official. In Madison County, they kept your records in a ledger that they called the Negro Book. How many of you understand that even today, being literate is not a requirement for public office? Either is being honest. Guess where the $500 went? But you get one of these. Do you have one of these, sir? You do. He knew the answer. You see how quick he said, yeah, I do. Okay. The law that says that he has to have one of these as a free black also gives me the power to do this. Is he yours? Is he yours? Or are you attached to anybody? No, you're not. You're mine now. Because all I have to do is tear this up, get a hold of you, take you out, you say bye-bye, I get to sell them, even if you were free. So my point is that even if you escaped, even if you were granted your freedom, even if you bought your freedom, in Illinois, you were not free at all. This is the reason why people lived in rural areas, because chances of me tearing this up and destroying it were greatly remotely implausible, because one of your neighbors would stop me. But you mentioned a lawsuit. It's accurate. Depending upon the circumstance, a slave in the United States was empowered to sue for their freedom. It really dealt on a number of issues, such as what were the terms of the will that their previous owner had. Some previous owners did grant manumission. Some previous owners granted manumission of slaves if the liquidation of the rest of the property settled debts. Okay. In some cases, you had in the 1700s, you had some Americans applying standards of English law. The Somerset case, for example, of the early 1800s, manumitted a number of slaves in England. Okay, so yes, you did have that plausible opportunity. That was relatively rare. That's relatively rare. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if you could. Yes, possible. Describe how a slave came to riverbanks, where they would go, and what would be their next step, and then how far would they have to go?
Yeah, and you're asking me to describe as simply as possible. Oh boy, that's oxymoronic. As simply as possible, how a slave would come from the riverbank, escape to, and where they would go after that. The first thing that I would qualify by saying is that generally we don't know, the information is lost to us. We can guesstimate. As yes, the old rock house. Yes, yeah. It depended upon, it had really depended upon the years that we're talking about, because these lines were operating somewhere between the early 1820s all the way to the mid 1860s. And they operated for a short span of time, as best we can understand, and seem to have existed only within a short context. Enos Apartments, for example, which was built in 1858, operated, the best we understand, in the 1860s. Enos Apartments, across from the YWCA. Reason why we believe it operated in the 1860s was at the time, shortly after its construction, the Civil War hit, and Eastern Missouri was in tumult with the bushwhackers and so forth. Bushwhackers were going through Eastern Missouri, and they were kidnapping slaves and selling them down in Arkansas as a way of financing their activity. And the bushwhackers threatened to come across here to Illinois. They did come across to Illinois, burned down Alhambra, New Douglas, threatened our community, the Black community in Litchfield. And there seemed to have been a measure of escaping slaves then. The old Rock House and the buildings in the Upper Alton area, like the old Priest's Retreat and the Bach House at 2626 Judson, those seem to have been active in the 1820s, when the destination was instead getting out of town, not into Canada. And again, I emphasize the idea of voiding where they would not have to have freedom papers as being an ultimate necessity, because in some cases you just go in a rural area. No, Wood Station, for example, Salu, Oakwood, in Alton, Rocky Fork, okay, New Philadelphia up in Pike County. You go into a rural area, and and you can exist as a free person there without the need of freedom papers. That possibility became greatly reduced after the Fugitive Slave Acts became more and more aggressive in the 1850s. It varied. It varied from place to place. It varied by time period. Okay. Does that answer your question, kind of? Okay. I see a question in the back and I got to answer it because it's my ride home. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. A few years ago, you took me, my girlfriend, and I think two of your nephews
Mhm.
on a tour. And you showed us a building down the street from Horse Fan Grade School, where we would walk right by the school.
The old rock house. Yeah.
Every day home. And had no idea that history was in there. When you first found out about that, about the history of that particular building, how did you feel? What did you feel when you found out that every day you walked to school, or we walked to school, we were walking by history?
I just hope Mom didn't send Reggie back up there to get the paper that Mr. Tinsley gave us to give to her. Because what I remember, I'm dating myself with Tinsley, I know. What I remember was that was the old rock house backyard was where we kids used to throw the papers we had to take home, and used to irritate the heck out of the owner of that property because they would call the school all the time and complain. It didn't connect with me any more than realizing the Great Box House was used to hide escaped slaves. But okay. Word up, yeah. Okay. It was like, oh wow. There was another reaction that I had with it. My childhood hero was Ralph Bunche. I might be mentioning that name. Some of you might be familiar with it. Ralph Bunche's family was here in Alton. It was the family of, I don't know if you're familiar with Lloyd Johnson, the Johnson family farm. That's Ralph Bunche's cousins. I didn't realize it was till I was reading Ralph Bunche's biography in the 1990s. I called Mom up. I said, Mom, did you know Ralph Bunche had family in Alton? And she said, he grew up on Lloyd Johnson's farm. I said, you're kidding? Oh, yes, Eric, that's true. Mary and Josephine were Ralph Bunche's cousins. My Sunday school teachers, you're kidding, Mom. Yeah. This is actually what I had with Mom. I said, well, Mom, I went to Howard University to study in the political science department of Ralph Bunche. And you mean to tell me that Ralph Bunche's family farm was 5 miles from my house? He said, yes, Eric, you just graduated from high school. We would have done anything to get you out of this house. Yes, sir. You had a question.
So 1820s, 1860s, the Underground Railroad, with branches to Ohio, Chicago, et cetera, right?
That's a very good question as far as the date and locations of the Underground Railroad. I need to correct something that generally people have. It wasn't something. It was rather disorganized. No, it was not. Yes, those were individual efforts. We have to remember it was illegal.
Yes. So, looking for opportunity, I decided I'm going to make it up to St. Louis somehow, right? Was it just word of mouth?
We don't know. Well, first of all, the slaves coming through St. Louis, or the slaves were located in slave markets in St. Louis, came from the Upper South, came from the Ohio River Valley. And they also came to St. Louis by means of the Cumberland Gap and the National Road. from Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Kentucky, and so forth. St. Louis was the primary hub for the buying and selling of Negroes who would go into the Deep South. So to use a term that we're all familiar with, St. Louis was a logistics hub. And we have to remember that most of the people settled in the eastern part of Missouri were from Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. And the human beings who came here would escape through the Alton Underground Railroad. And there were others who escaped other ways. For example, another important hub, it was built as that, was Memphis. Memphis was where the Tennesseans bought their slaves to take them into Texas to grow cotton in Mexican territory. And so what seemed to have happened with the people who came to Memphis, usually the people who were brought over to Memphis came from places like Nashville, or they came from the other side of the Appalachian Mountains in South Carolina. And when they came into Memphis, if they were going to escape, it would be west into Mexican territory. People who were ultimately taken down to Alabama, came to Alabama by way of Louisville and of Nashville. And those were the ones who tended to go through Ohio. Okay. But basically, if we remember the line that are rays the shortest distance between 2 points, they were basically functioning as rays. They go every which way. They go every which way. Now, how they knew where to go is still a matter of speculation. There's some things that we understand facilitated escapes, such as religious organizations, not just the AME Church, not just the Wood River Baptist District, organization of Black Baptists here in Illinois, but also with the Presbyterians. There was a group of Presbyterians called the Covenanters who helped ferry escapes of slaves. You had as well communities of Catholics who were helping people escape, or German Catholics especially. There was that. There was, we do understand that organizations, Masons, for example, were involved in it. We do understand that messages were given. The Negro spirituals, which are entirely metaphorical. Don't believe me? Listen to Bessie Smith. Listen to the blues. They're metaphorical. Gives you a whole new idea about what baseball's like. These are things that we think facilitated escapes, but we don't know. We don't understand exactly why. We're entirely speculative. People took this to their grave. You know?
But we have an idea.
We have a slight one.
From public records as posted one escaped slave.
Uh-huh.
We have an idea how many people made progress through.
A very bare idea. Very bare idea.
Thousands?
I wouldn't give a number. I wouldn't give a number. The closest thing that I could describe that one can use to get it is to look at the census records from about the 1880s. That would give you an idea. The 1880s was before the Great Migration of Negroes. And so you can see in certain communities in the 1880s what the Negro population was, and you can get a guesstimate. Yeah, that's a very bare thing, but that's working on the idea that you had literate census takers, because census takers were not literate at all. Give you an example. We do know that there were 3 or 4 significant Negro communities in Madison County. Rocky Fork, before the Civil War, Rocky Fork, Wood Station, Lovejoy, Illinois, in the American Bottom, and Pinnacle Colony, outside of Edwardsville. If you look at the census records from the 1850s to 1860s, 1 year these communities appear, next year they disappear. 1 year they appear in one set of records, next year they don't appear. And the only way to, and there were census records taken every 5 years by the state of Illinois. And there's also the same thing. 1 year they appear, next year they don't. The one estimation that's most likely the result of this is that communities were not noticed by the census takers. That's most likely. Because remember, census takers had a very capricious type of description. My brother's in the back. Look at him. Go ahead and look at him. He's not gonna break your glasses. Look at me. Would you believe that they would not agree on whether we were Negro or mulatto? Depends on the census taker. They wouldn't agree. We're genetic copies. Or rather, I'm sorry, I'm a genetic copy of him. That's more appropriate. Okay, but they would not agree that we're both Negroes or we're both mulatto. It depends. Okay, that's an indication that the education of our census takers was not very precise when it came to race. So it's likely that they were not precise about noticing communities too. You mean New England? The New England state? Yeah. If you are born in the Northeast, would you be considered freeborn? I'm pausing because there's some assumptions that we're making. First of all, that birth location has any ability in ascertaining that you're quote unquote free. Secondly, we have to understand that our concept of free may not have jived with their concept of free. No, your daughter would be considered freeborn simply because she's your daughter. Depending upon the state and the locality, that was a variable definition. In some states, such as the state of Virginia and the state of Maryland and the state of Pennsylvania, your child's status would depend upon the inferior status of whatever member of the family is inferior. For example, if you're free as a woman and your husband were a slave, your daughter would be a slave, for example. Yeah. In other state jurisdictions, I think Ohio is one, the status of the child depended upon the status of the mother. So if you were, say, in Covington, Kentucky, and you moved across river to Cincinnati and gave birth to your child, even though your child was born in free territory, your child would still be considered a slave in Kentucky. Okay. The so-called birthright citizenship comes after the Civil War, unfortunately. Okay. Hello. Oh, yes, I see you. Should I sit down for this? Yes. Yes, ma'am. The Underground Road. Yes, as best as we can understand the Underground Railroad, we're not talking about an actual organization Because again, we must remember this is trafficking in stolen property. It's like talking about, pardon the phrase, it's fair racist, but it's like talking about the mafia or quote, organized crime. Comment is it's not very organized. It's a legal activity. And the generic term is used for our frame of reference, organized crime. Okay, Underground Railroad is along the same lines, and you are right, it is a metaphor. And we should think about it exclusively as a metaphor. This is a metaphorical reference to the method used to take human beings from slavery to freedom, however they define slavery and however they define freedom. Underground Railroad, you mentioned in the 1820s. Underground Railroad actually began early in the 1620, when slavery is introduced to the continental North America, and it continued all the way into the end of the American Civil War, 1865. There was some type of method used to take human beings from slavery to bondage. Yes. Yes. Thank you for that, for helping me clarify that. But yes, it is a metaphor. I have to remind people it's not a choo-choo train that runs through tunnels. You'd be amazed who's disappointed about that. And you're putting on your coat. Oh yeah, temperature drops 20 degrees when I come in. Did you know that I'm a vampire? He swears I'm a vampire. He threw up when he saw me the first time. He was so excited. Any other questions? Did I handle all your questions? Yes, ma'am. The community of Lovejoy? Okay. I gotta drink my water for that one. Lovejoy, Illinois was founded in the 1830s by a free Black woman named Priscilla Baltimore. Priscilla Baltimore was from Kentucky. She brought the AME Church into St. Louis, and she organized 3 churches in particular. She organized St. James AME Church in St. Louis, Alton AME Church, which later became Campbell Chapel AME Church, is now Trinity AME Church, and the others Allen Chapel, Quinn Chapel in Lovejoy, Illinois. She named it Lovejoy, Illinois, after her friend Elijah Lovejoy. Very much the same way that Lincoln, Illinois is named after Abraham Lincoln before he became famous. Okay, and Lovejoy, Illinois is where my thumbs are. Okay, here is St. Clair County. Here is Madison County, right where my thumbs are, right on the county line. Okay, for one very simple reason. It's because of this. The way it worked was that was a free Black community immediately across river from North St. Louis. If you're familiar with the story of Mrs. Mary Meacham and Meacham's Crossing, she was trying to get the escaped slaves for the St. Louis slave market into Lovejoy, Illinois. Okay. The way this worked was that if you are in a rural area, chances are nobody will find you. But mind you, we're talking about officials who are not literate, nor officials who are honest. And so what they were told, what seemed to have been, was that since Lovejoy, Illinois is in the middle of someplace rural and the middle of 2 counties, most likely what happened was if somebody from St. Clair County came looking for an escaped slave, you could say, we're in Madison County. And if somebody from Madison County came looking for an escaped slave, you could say, we're in St. Clair County. Literally. Lovejoy, Illinois is a community that some of us know as Brooklyn, Illinois. Right there on Route 3. Route 3 and stuck in there that the school is named Lovejoy School. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I was just wondering, and maybe a question, if you're able to trace your family back to wherever it may have originated.
Well, you know, Roots was a 6-hour show. And I only got 40 minutes. I was able to do some family history, and DNA testing did quite a bit with the rest. There were some interesting things that I discovered about my family. First of all, I knew that there was significant European admixture in my family because my straight matrilineal line was a woman named Miss Sissy. But I did not know where Miss Sissy was from. Most, according to the DNA testing, Miss Sissy was from around Poland and Lithuania, and she was a descendant of Ashkenazi Jews. That was one thing that was fascinating. My brother has an interesting ear tag on him. It's a birthmark. It appears in our family as the sign of the firstborn of the generation. His oldest son, my nephew had it. Our mother had it, and they were also firstborn of their generation. I had encountered it. Oh, and according to family story, my maternal grandmother's paternal grandfather had that ear tag. I found it in only one person outside of the family. It was a young man from Troy, Illinois. He should be now almost 30. And when I saw him at the Metrolink site, near work, I looked at him, I said, "Oh, you're the firstborn grandchild." He said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" I said, "Your ear told me." He had this ear tag. He was a white male. And apparently the ear tag was from the Welsh side of the family. The family's name was a Welsh name, surname. So apparently that family had introduced to it. That's something I knew. I knew that the first ancestor that came here was part of the population settlement that occurred after the French and Indian War. She was trying to avoid the English. The Bienvenus settled here as French people, and they came from French Canadian Catholic to French Protestant. And I kind of had an idea where they were from, but I found out more particularly, it was true, they were from southwestern France, the Pyrenees Mountains. That was kind of interesting. What was also very fascinating were the stories that I found out about my African ancestry. I had the idea that my West African ancestry had arrived relatively early. Some things indicated. Through DNA testing. First of all, one thing that DNA testing demonstrated was that members of my family that came here were originally Muslim. They were people who had relatives in what is now the Central African Republic and also Nigeria. There was a Muslim group of people who were nomadic from the Central African Republic who moved to Nigeria, who were engaged in a standard bush war, we would call it bush war, with the other population of the Akan. They were called Fulani people. And so these Fulani people were my relatives, apparently. Also was rather interesting, we did know that my family had Native American ancestry. However, the Native American ancestry that the DNA testing pointed out was that the family and Native American ancestry is with the Amazonian Indians. Now, no, we didn't have anybody in the Amazon, but the Amazonian Indians were relatives of the population that was native to the Caribbean, the Tiano, and they are the Tiano's only living relatives. So most likely that would mean that whoever came early in the transatlantic slave trade was situated in some place like the Bahamas, intermarried with somebody of Tiano ancestry, and then moved into the Americas. What also is very interesting as well was this odd set of relatives that we had that were Sierra Leone people. Creole was the name that they gave. The Creole people of Sierra Leone were originally American slaves who were loyalists during the Revolution. They escaped the United States in the 1780s, first settled in New Brunswick, Canada, and then were relocated in Sierra Leone. Did you want any more? Time for a commercial break. Get it 5 minutes. I did it in 5 minutes. That's long. That's shorter than the story about Kunta Kinte was looking for a drum, and then this happened. Any other questions? I've truly enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Please remember that the Alton Visitor Center, or I'm sorry, the Great Rivers and Routes, CVB, is having Underground Railroad tours. We do have a couple of former customers here, and they are starting again in April. And if you call them at 1-800-ALTONIL, they'd be happy to accommodate you. And I'll be there for the tour. And believe it or not, I get to start talking forever. You know, I actually did have this one occasion in which I was asked about my family's. This is back in the 1990s. I was asked about it. I had this big motor coach full of people. And I was asked by somebody about my family, and I was talking about my family about it. We were at our first stop, which was the Enos Apartments. I said, well, we got to get going. You know, I'll be, by the time I finish talking, the tour's going to be over. In 6 hours, it's going to be all gone. Got on the motor coach and drove on to the rest of the tour. And then we had lunch. And I said, after the tour, I said, I'll show you where my family's from. That was a real bright idea. We went out to Rocky Fork. You heard about that one, did you? No, it's funny. It's going to get you warm, really. And we went out to Rocky Fork, and there's no place for the bus to turn around. No place for the motor coach to turn around. Big 40-passenger motor coach and little tiny little roads, no place to turn around. And so bad news comes towards. A cousin of mine came by and said, well, Eric, if you go down the hill and turn around at the creek, you'll be able to turn around and come back. Okay, I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. We got everybody off the bus at the church. We sitting around. And 40 minutes later, the bus hadn't arrived. So I got concerned. So I went down the hill. And just about when I got to the bend, I heard the roar, roar, roar. He took out a bumper and he popped a hose. Roar, roar. And I was getting kind of concerned because this is for the days of broadband when you needed a tower signal. And those hills are very poor for tower signals, you know? And so I didn't have a cell phone contact or anything like that. And worse yet, we didn't have a bathroom. And guess who was all on that tour? Old women. And so, I just kind of walked back up. I couldn't figure out what to do. And then I saw something that made my day. A police cruiser. You've never seen a young black man so happy to see a deputy sheriff in the middle of the country. I was just so ecstatic. And I said to the deputy sheriff, okay, you got that big cruiser? Great. You take all these people, you take them all the way over to the Holiday Inn, they get in their vans, and that's how we ferried people out. And so it took us about an hour and a half to get all those people off they're so glad because they had to go to the bathroom. And so we got it off. And so we were able to, the sheriff called the dispatch called for Bowers. Bowers had that big record, came in with that big record, and he was able to get the bus. And poor driver was shaking. I said, this is one heck of a day, isn't it? He said, oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah. I really got this day. I was praying real bad. You praying real bad? What are you a religious man? I'm a reverend. You're a reverend? What's your name? Reverend Fraction. I thought to myself, yeah, a day like this, I got Reverend Fraction. I needed a whole number. Thank you very much. I thought so. I recognize the voice. I was thinking about you. It's been a while. How you been doing? Yeah, it was.
I'm sorry to say it. You know, Darren's yeah, I know. Darren, thank you. He's been writing letters for him for about 10 years. You know, I just talked to him. I talked to him before the money problem because Bud Schultz had his during the Street for 3 years ago. Darren sitting with him. Oh yeah, Bud Schultz and